Hello and welcome back to our series of interviews with Euros members around the world. It's a huge pleasure to see and to introduce you to Sylvia Ehrlich, Intrepid Relocation. I have had the privilege of knowing Sylvia for 20 years, and it's always a pleasure to see you and to catch up. How are you? And just tell everybody where you are as well.
Okay, I'm doing well, thank you at this point. I'm in New York, but I'm in Westchester County, which is about 30 miles north of New York City. Westchester County was the epicenter for a while, not my region, thankfully, gratefully, but the other side of the county did have a major ground zero situation. My office is in Manhattan. I have not been to my office since March 10th. Yeah. So we've had contingency plans in place for our office with VPN lines and making sure that we have everything secure and total access to all of our information and data and our clients at any time remotely. So we're very fortunate that way, but the office closed on the 12th, but the last time I was in was on the 10th.
Gosh, that's been going on for a long time. I mean, I would suggest then that you were quite ahead of the curve, being quite sensible quite early on.
Well, as you and I had discussed earlier, my husband had come down with a virus and pneumonia. And so I was very sensitive to him. I have to take a train commute into the city. It's an above ground train, but I do take a train into the city. The trains were getting a little odd and they were starting to get very crowded. I was getting very uncomfortable about that issue. I walked from Grand Central to my office, but I didn't like the trains and the train situation. So fortunately for me, I cut back my time and started working remotely sooner than most people.
That's amazing. And you were all set up actually for remote working, right?
Yes. Yes, always been set up for remote working. So if the weather's been inclement or anything else, we could do that. A lot of our team accesses everything remotely at all times. We've made sure we have all the security. So we have all of our, in the US Privacy Shield, which is affiliated with the GDPR. We have all of the guidelines, security, and everything else in place.
And I must just ask you, your husband is okay now. How is his recovery?
Yes, he's doing better. Thank you very much. He came down with this at the beginning of February, just after we come back from a trip to Palm Beach. They told us it was a virus, but they didn't know what type of virus. It wasn't one of the usual ones. And they said it came with a residual cough. So we let it go at that. It was way too soon. They didn't even think about testing then. They didn't have any testing at that point. So we don't know to this day what type of a virus he had, or if it was actually the COVID, but we'll wait until things clear up a long time and then he could be tested for antibodies, as will I.
Right.
But just to be on the safe side, and he did come down with the pneumonia, so we wanted to be very safe.
Absolutely. And you were just saying before we got onto the recording that you had a bit of a scare last week. That's
right. I had gone out for a walk, one of the few walks I've been able to take because the weather's not been great here, and I just could not breathe. I really had a difficult time. I had to call my husband to come and drive and pick me up. I had gone about 2 miles and that was it. So I had him pick me up. And then the following day, I went up a flight of stairs and couldn't breathe. So we called the doctor and I had my first medical video exam. And she was wearing a mask, so I'm not sure if anything is contagious through the screen or not, but there we go.
That's a worry.
She determined that it was my asthma had gotten very severe due to the weather, and part of the road I walk is a dirt road, and there were a couple of cars that came through, so the dust that kicked up may have caused that. We don't know. In March, I had a couple of minor symptoms, but since I didn't have any fever, I was in no hurry to go to the doctor or call the doctor, or I don't go to doctors very often anyway. And this was a forced one. My husband forced me. He said, if you're not breathing, you have to call. That's important. Breathing is important.
Especially now,
Anytime breathing is important.
Right.
So she diagnosed that my asthma had gotten way out of control, and that my inhaler was not strong enough. So she prescribed some new ones, and that's what I'm on right now. So I can breathe and talk to you and not turn blue.
I'm very glad to hear it. I spoke with Susan Ginsburg a couple of weeks back, and she's also very
I thought that was a lovely conversation.
Yeah, and she said, I mean, that back, being where you are was a scary place to be. It really did
Very
kick off right
difficult,
where
yeah.
you are. Yeah.
Well, we're very fortunate because we're not in a flat. So we could walk straight out. We don't have an elevator to deal with or other people to deal with that way. We can become hermits, and we have 2 levels, which is also lovely because if I don't want to see my husband, I'm not stuck with him all the time either. Right? Having 2 levels is a good thing when you're quarantined. Uh, so so we are very fortunate that way. Also, we're really in an area that's very wooded and a very low density population. So when I go for my walks down the road, and I've posted some pictures on Facebook that some of my some colleagues have seen as well. And when I walk on those roads, if I see anybody, it's unusual. The other day I had one lone runner
Right.
go past me, but otherwise it's just the birds and the chipmunks.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? How you kind of, you suddenly, I mean, the things, I was talking with Frances Edmonds yesterday, and she said, I'm always looking upwards. I'm not looking downwards. Like she said, I'm in central London, but I have a house, I have a garden, I can step outside, there's a park opposite. You know, all of these things that previously, I guess, we just took for granted suddenly become so important.
In today's world, particularly with the population density in New York and what's happening in the New York area, it really does make a difference, and it does feel good.
Now, tell me what the situation is right now. Have things improved in New York?
There has been an improvement. The testing, of course, has increased. So the number of cases, positive cases, has increased in terms of
Sure.
the numbers because of the number of people tested. But the good news is that well, you know, as everybody says, any death is bad, but the good news is that the death ratio now is below 300. So it's really dropped dramatically. We were seeing very high numbers in the thousands per day, and that was really awful. And even 300, 280 is a lot, but those numbers are going down. The number of people being admitted to hospitals has also dropped dramatically. So that's very good news as well. And we hope that that continues. As people start, the weather is now starting to clear a little and warm up. As people start to go out, my fear factor is what's going to happen in 2 weeks.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the same sort of thing that's happening across Europe as well. We're in a very similar situation. I wanted to ask, the response in the US obviously is state by state. So what are the restrictions?
It's actually region by region. Because
is it?
Oh yes, because what's happening in the New York City area is very different than, for example, I always use Elmira or Schenectady, New York.
Mm-hmm.
Buffalo, New York City, the big urban areas are really being hit hard in the Northeast, or at least in the New York State area. But then you have small towns like Schenectady or Elmira. They've not even seen COVID.
Really?
So they don't understand why they have to be locked up. You can understand that from their perspective.
It's a very interesting dynamic, isn't it? Because like you say, I mean, it's not quite the same here, I must admit. And do you think that's because the restrictions were put in place quite swiftly in New York State, that it didn't
I think
spread?
some of it is the restriction. I think some of it has to be the restrictions that were put in place. And the other has to do with the demographics and where planes were going, where people were coming and going. You don't have, as a general rule, a flight into Elmira. It would be a local flight. You wouldn't have a corporate meeting necessarily there unless it was a conference. So that would make a difference as well. They wouldn't have the demographics, they wouldn't have the reasoning for that. So you would have it in key cities or resort areas that were hosting conferences or special meetings.
Mm. So, and tell me, what's happening across the rest of the US? I mean, New York was the epicenter. Is that still the case, or is it gradually spread west?
I think well, New York is still a big hotbed, but you've had pockets. You had New Orleans, which had a big hit just a few weeks after Mardi Gras, because they did have Mardi Gras.
And it went ahead.
And it went ahead because remember, it was mid-February.
Of course it was.
It was in February.
Yeah.
So at that point, people weren't necessarily thinking that way. So they got hit several weeks right after that because you had people coming in from all over. And so New Orleans got hit, Miami had a hit. You've seen it in San Francisco, of course, they got hit. Chicago now it's gone in waves from to and from different cities, key cities. Most of the country has been pretty locked down. But as I say, there are some areas where they've had minimal impact, and those areas really don't understand why they can't. And I'm sure you've heard, I don't know if you have or not, but Northern Michigan has been very upset about being locked down as severely as they
Yes,
are.
of course, the protests.
Detroit got hit hard, and they're starting to see some good news with the lockdown they had. But in Northern Michigan, they don't understand why they're locked down, just like parts of New York State don't understand why they have to be locked down or why they can't go to work. So that's a difficult situation. Georgia, you have the same thing. Atlanta got hit, but there are parts of Georgia where they've not seen anything, so they don't understand what that is all about. The American way, and I'm a Canadian, but I've learned the American way.
Right.
The American way is freedom, right? Personal freedom, personal rights.
Yeah.
And so they feel like for a month, they were willing to make that sacrifice, 2 months. But some of them are looking at the reality that they may not make an income for 3-4 months. And the majority of the country, they have done some studies, say that most people either live from paycheck to paycheck, or at most will have a 2-month residual savings to be able to carry themselves for 2 months. The government has been helping, but what the government thinks is helpful in one area and can be in lower cost regions doesn't get very far. So the paycheck, the government was giving out an amount. If you earned a salary of under $100,000 a year, they were giving out $1,200 per person and $600 per child, which can go very far or further in the Midwest and in the South, and certainly areas where you're not in key urban environments where there's a high cost of living. If you get that same amount and you're living in Manhattan, that's not going to take you very far. That might not even pay your rent, even with all the children's amounts. So it really, it's a real challenge. One of the issues also that's come up is the government was being trying to be very generous in terms of adding money to the people that are on unemployment insurance right now. They're receiving unemployment insurance. So they've added another $600 per week per check to anyone on unemployment insurance. The issue there is there are some people who, whatever, their salaries were high, and that barely cuts it for them, even with the extra 600. But you have other people who were earning a lot less, and now they're making more than what they were earning when they were working. So it's a dichotomy and it's a challenge. And then some of the employers are concerned that their people won't come back to work until that extra 600 goes away. And part of the money that those employers are receiving has a criteria where they have to pay 2 months of salary. If these people don't come back until July, they will then lose that as grant. They will have to pay that as a loan. So it's a really difficult situation.
I mean, there's quite a few things there that are, really interesting. I mean, firstly, the financial measures were taken on a national level, whereas with states knowing their own economies much better in some ways, like you say, that amount of money in California or in New York is going to be a completely different equation to how far that money is going to go in Atlanta.
They just look at it across the board.
Yeah, wow. And did the state governors have quite a lot to say about that?
I think you frozen.
Sorry, yeah, I froze. Did the state governors have quite a lot to say about that?
Well, I think they all have a lot to say because they're state governors.
Yes, true.
I also think it's been, as I've said to people, my opinion, and it's only my opinion. I think this has been a perfect storm because we have the pandemic hit in the middle of a major election year. And so politics came into play when they shouldn't.
Yeah.
If this hadn't been an election year, I think that this is again, my opinion, I would hope that the entire government from all sides would have come together to make this a better situation for all and work together as a team. But I think because it is an election year, there's too much politics that have seeped into this that shouldn't.
It's such a shame, isn't it, that there isn't some kind of like emergency political power that can be put in place to force like cross-party agreement on.
That's not human nature.
No, true. It's not. I mean, Interestingly, the political nature and dimension of this for the US has been crazy. I mean, obviously, we've all been watching the news, although I have to say I've stopped watching the news a while ago. But I mean, from that point of view,
I watch the Hallmark Channel.
okay,
Happy endings.
nice TV. Yeah,
No violence.
Yeah, absolutely. We have Ted's mum is living with us right now, and we're watching similar kind of things. Feel good TV. But it is fascinating that the way the way that the news has picked up on this, and the way that it's been spread, across all of our screens as a total disaster. And I'm wondering if some of the protests that you saw in places like North Michigan are in some ways kind of, well, the reality doesn't seem so bad. So how come we're at home?
Well, I think that again, it's where the areas have the major impact. So you have areas like northern Michigan, you have areas like parts of northern New York State, other than Buffalo, where the population density is very small, it's minimal. They don't have flights that would have come in from these places. It would be rare for them to have any individuals. They may never have even had a single case of COVID in their region. Yet they had to gear up for it. They had to be prepared for it, which is fine. Everyone should be ready, prepared for any emergency. I'm a firm proponent of that. But they've not seen anything. And since they've not seen anything, and it's now been, for some people, it's been a long time. I mean, I refer to, somebody said to me, I've really forgotten what day it is. I said, oh, I know, it's March 86.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, quite. It does. Yeah. Yeah.
So for some people, it's been 2 months. For some people, it's been 3 months. So and they're looking at 4 or 5 months. The weather is warming up. They're hearing things that the virus doesn't do well in warm weather. So they're saying, well, and the United States is very much about individual rights and freedom. So they're very concerned about why they're not allowed. I mean, Michigan has its own situation, and again, some of it, I don't know if it's reality or if it's politics or what it is, but I personally had an issue when they said they can plant seeds, in a supermarket or in a Walmart where they had the seed section, it was closed off because they weren't allowed to plant seeds. And I'm going, why wouldn't you be allowed to plant seeds? So, so I mean, those are issues that each state has. They have to divide and determine what their situation is. The governor in New York State, his concern is that if he opens up upstate New York, that people from New York City might, out of desperation, want to get there and go into a restaurant or do something and carry it with them. So that's his concern. But the people up there are going, but we have nothing. Why are you freezing us out? Why can't we go to a hairdresser? Why can't we go to our office? Why can't we function and have our businesses functioning the way we want to have our, as best as we can. So I think that that's part of the issue for different regions of the country. The Midwest, I don't think, was hit as hard. So they're also wondering where and why. The governor of Florida has been hit hard in the media, but at the same time, he's been cautious, and he's been trusting the individuals to act as grown-ups. You don't always have grown-ups. That's the problem, is not everybody. I was listening to your conversation with Asa, and she was saying, in Sweden, when the government tells us something, we listen.
Yeah, it's really,
not so much.
That is a really interesting part of this. And actually, I was on a call this morning with Sylvia Ehrlich, who's going to do some intercultural research on this for us, because for a country, like you said, like the US, which is, culturally as right along the spectrum of individuality. This is an individual country. You are making your own decisions. That's the whole basis of the American way, like you said.
Exactly. Right.
And to then curtail quite so much when, for example, as Åsa said, and as Johanna had said in another interview, in Sweden, they said, this is what we suggest you do, because it's and they did it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Canadian, and Canada, as a general rule, if they tell you, you do it too. You just follow the rules.
Yeah.
But here, not so much. No. So you have that individuality. You definitely have that situation going on, and it is a challenge. It is a challenge. But you also have people saying, "Why can't I take a walk in a park?" But then I noticed, I saw I saw a group, I was telling my husband this morning, I saw a group of people walking on a bridge in New York this weekend when it was a lovely warm day. Half had masks on, half did not. So it's like,
Yeah.
it's not that difficult. And the city was giving out masks for
Right.
free.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you say, I don't understand.
Uh-huh.
I don't understand. The people are being very foolish. It may be their right, but it's not their right to risk my life.
Correct. And this is, I mean, again, this is where it's so interesting. You talk about, different cultures, like, for example, Germany is in the process of now opening up. And again, people are, well, it's a very authoritarian culture anyway, so people do what they're told. But in terms of America's exit strategy, do you have any milestones right now as to when things will change, or is it still just
Well, again, it's very interesting because the United States is a group of federated states. So each state has some autonomy. They're guided by the federal government, but each state has its own autonomy. So when things were initially, when they wanted to do the lockdowns and some states were not locking down, everybody was yelling that the federal government should lock them down. And then the federal government said it's up to the individual governors and their states to do that. Then when they wanted to start not opening or not opening, some states were talking about opening, then there was this big hue and cry to the federal government to stop them from opening. Well, they couldn't stop them from closing. They can't stop them from opening either. So those are rules unless he declares martial law.
right.
It's very difficult to do something like that. So it's very confusing to a lot of people if they haven't studied this. And I have to say, I've studied some of it. I needed to study some of it to become a US citizen, but I also studied it out of curiosity and interest. But it's very different. It's very different than the government I knew growing up in Canada because of the way it's structured. So it's unique in the way it was set up as a government and the way it runs as a government. It's difficult too because it is a political season. Because we don't have the most articulate people out there, shall we say, to present the case, it becomes more of a challenge. Yeah, so sure. It is difficult whichever way you look at it, and it's a perfect storm because it is a political season, in addition to being a pandemic season. So it becomes a challenge. All of those things become a challenge. Our borders closed. Not fast enough, I don't think. They closed in January for China, but they didn't close in January for the rest of the world. They closed later for the rest of the world. So some of that got traveled through circuitous routes and still came. New York, again, as I say, New York is just it's a perfect storm for a pandemic because you had, for example, the gentleman from Westchester County, he's an attorney, he had his offices just outside of Grand Central. He took the train in every day and he walked through Grand Central, went up the escalators, walked through the hallways to get to his office. He encountered thousands of people every single day and he didn't know he was sick. And then he went to some events and those events spread it out and it just kept going from there. So you have a situation where New York City is going to be a tough one to bring back on board. I mean, the subways, how do you keep those subways safe?
Yeah.
How do you keep the subways safe? The trains that I'm on, they could conceivably do something with them, but it runs more than one route a day. So do they shut it down after the first route and spray it again? And how can they do that? They really can't. So it's going to be bringing the city on board is going to be a real challenge. Bringing some of the other key cities like Chicago on board can be a challenge. DC can be a challenge for the same reasons. Mm-hmm. Any place that uses and relies on public transportation will be a challenge. Los Angeles mostly is run by car.
Yep, good point.
So that should be less than an issue. So it's going to be the key cities where you're not driving in automobiles, you're driving in public transportation.
It's so extraordinary, isn't it? Because we thought that lockdown was complicated, but opening back up is going to be very complex, very complex.
It's going to be complex in certain regions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Some areas it's not going to be difficult at all.
Very true. Yeah, where we live, you have to get in the car to do everything. There is,
right.
I'm in the middle of the countryside, so it's completely different. But then
we're in the countryside, we can't even get deliveries. I mean, grocery deliveries.
Right.
We have our own arrangements where what we do is we have a butcher greengrocer, and he's a small operation. He's right in downtown Chappaqua, and we call him and we place our order with him, and he's got dairy products and all kinds of meats and fresh vegetables, and I trust the quality of what he has. And it may cost a little bit more. I'll get my olive oil and whatever from him as well. We place the order. He calls us the next day when it's ready, and then we drive over, and they're totally mask gown, visors, and they just put it in the trunk, and we take it home.
Yeah.
So that's the way we have to function. Other areas, when you're in a more densely populated area, you can get your deliveries brought to you. Now in Manhattan, there are a lot of buildings that have really locked down. Really? So you have doorman buildings where they don't allow anybody in but the residents. So if you have a delivery, it comes downstairs and you have to come down and pick it up.
Right.
And that's much safer for a lot of people. It's interesting because with removals companies, they're considered essential services in Manhattan.
Oh, right.
So they can work, and I know in London they're not, because we went through a bit of an episode with someone there.
Did you? Okay.
So we know that they're not, but we found a small provider that was able to help us out with somebody there, with a situation there. But the buildings won't allow them in. So if you're in a non-doorman building, you might get lucky if you have a super or somebody that's willing to allow them to come through, but as a general rule, they can't come through. Realtors in the suburban areas are showing properties where they let them in, or they're doing virtual tours and drive-by tours, or they're drive-by and they let the people go into the house. In right. Manhattan, that's really not happening at all. Mm-hmm. You can't show properties. It's really a challenge to show properties. Again, unless it's a small building that doesn't have a doorman and they're more flexible. But for the most part, you can't show properties. So it's become a bit of a challenge in terms of those kinds of situations, how they open that up, how they work with that. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, it is going to be very, very complex. I mean, and from the point of view of talking with your clients and your customers, are you seeing, most of the people that I've spoken to said they're not actually seeing things being cancelled, they're seeing things being pushed forward. Is that the case?
Yes, most of the relocations that we have been pushed forward. Most of them are looking at now August, September.
Really? Okay.
A lot of it will depend on visas.
Yeah.
So
of course.
Some of them
are WhatsApping about that. Yeah, we were WhatsApping about that a couple of weeks ago. What's happening with that? Do you know anything more?
Well, it's my understanding that the visas that are the 3 to 5 year visas are still good to go.
Okay.
Going to be available, but there's going to be such a backlog of them. With the embassies and the consulates all closed, there's going to be quite a backlog once they do open. And we don't know when they're opening and in which countries and which areas that will happen. The flights have to be opened from those countries as well.
Yeah.
That's another issue. We have people coming from the AP region as well as from the European region, as well from EMEA. So a lot of that will depend on those situations, the criteria of the flights, the criteria of the visas. Those that already have visas in place, not too bad a problem. We also have people coming in from South America. It's going to be a question of the flight permissibility, but also when they can get appointments for their visas.
That's so complicated. I mean, it's so interesting because, again, we've kind of thought that most of Europe's borders were shut, but actually they're not. And I was talking to Martina Sharvai last week, and I was just asking after her daughter, who I know helped us at a conference meeting. I said, how's Clarissa? And she said, oh, she's flown back to London. I was like, what? She's done what? And literally, Lufthansa are still flying between Frankfurt and London, and she got a scheduled flight. She got on it. She said it was very empty. They were leaving the middle seats clear. They gave you a mask. She got back to London, got in a taxi and went back to her apartment. So things are still moving. But again, like you say, it's the really inter-regional, the flights from AP, the flights from South America. that's what's going to, the flights coming in from Europe, it's going to be more complex.
Well, right now the borders are closed. Even between Canada and the US, the borders
Yeah.
are closed.
Yeah.
So that's going to be an interesting one to see when that opens, how it opens, what they're going to determine, and how they're going to determine it.
And you're not getting any news about that at this stage. They're just things as are they are. Yeah. Yeah. Same here. Same in the UK.
No, it's all going to be a surprise.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? It's like there are so many rumours flying around right now in the UK about next Friday is VE Day and whether or not the government will announce a lessening of restrictions to, you know, get national spirit back. I don't know, but it's all very, very, very weird.
Well, again, you know, it's nice to have a national spirit, but it's also very important to be safe.
It's absolutely, and that's the thing.
Have a better national spirit the next time it comes around.
Quite exactly. Sylvia, it's been such a, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'm just saying it's been disconcerting and it's just frustrating, but we have to do what we have to do. We help our people where we can, and we all have to look out for each other and make sure that we help each other stay healthy and safe.
It's all that we can do at the moment, isn't it? It's the most, I mean, this is where, again, it's so interesting how, looking at this on a cultural level, it is our duty in society to do this as best we can. So.
Right. And again, it's difficult for me to give you the American version, although I've become more Americanized, but I still have the
Canadian. Yes.
Follow the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. Sylvia, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and it's a greater pleasure to see you. Take care and stay well and stay safe. And we'll catch up again in a couple of months and do this again, see where we are.
That would be lovely.
Fantastic.
Lovely. Maybe from my office.
Fingers crossed. Oh, that would be great, actually. Lovely to see you. Take care. Bye. Bye.